We're hitting rewind for this episode of Backstory, recorded back in October when Jasmine Gui, Real Asian Special Projects Programmer, joined us to discuss TACLA's Youth Critics Initiative, which we also call YCI. Perhaps biting off a bit more than we can chew, we discussed the role of criticism for filmmakers in Asian Canadian cinema history, as well as the evolution of YCI over the years. Tune in for what we hope will be a very nourishing episode.
To answer Jen's question about what I've been doing this past weekend, I've actually been watching hamster terrarium builds. It just reminded me. Like elaborate naturalistic hamster terrarium builds. Like they're huge.
Like how big?
Like the size of a calyx, IKEA calyx.
Whoa.
But
Because
calyx is
apparently-
modular, so there's lots of different sizes.
So a lot of people hack IKEA calyxes for their hamsters. And apparently it's because hamsters run like 5 miles a night every day.
Wow.
So they like need the space. Yeah. Isn't that wild? Wild.
That should be your background.
Hamster fact of the day. You're welcome.
Hello and welcome to Backstory, the podcast from Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. I'm one of your hosts, Aram Collier.
And I'm Kelly Lui, your other host of this podcast.
Kelly, it's been a while. We're a little bit rusty. We've been in the depths of programming. The festival is a month away. But we're actually going to talk about one of the things that is really exciting that happens during the festival today, our Youth Critics Initiative. And we have our colleague, Jasmine Gui here. Jasmine is one of our programmers, but also runs the Youth Critics Initiative. So Jasmine, actually, maybe this is your first appearance on the Backstory podcast. So maybe you can give us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay, hi, I'm Jasmine. As Aram mentioned, I'm one of the programmers at Relation. I'm the special projects programmer right now, and prior to that, I was the industry and education programmer at the festival. And I guess my other identities include artist and PhD student predominantly. And then I also do tea practice on the side. I would say that's like the dominant identity markers.
Nice. Yeah, wearing many hats. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you on was to talk not only about the Youth Critics Initiative specifically that is part of Real Asian and TACLA, but also just to kind of talk about the idea of criticism and the need for it, the process of it. So, so first off, I mean, specifically this program, can you talk a little bit about the history of it? And what is it? What is Youth Critics Initiative? Who is it for? Those kind of things.
Youth Critics Initiative started in 2019, I believe, and it actually started out of conversations that Kelly and I were having at the festival during the programming death period. And a lot of our conversations were around just like the kind of content we were seeing in the films, but also as we experienced the festival in 2018, there was also a lot of stuff in the media coverage of the festival that I was deeply dissatisfied with, just seeing how little of the festival was actually covered in media, and then what was covered was then extremely condensed or mostly focused on like selling points, big names, or extremely shallow talking points that are relatively fatigued, I would say, in the media industry regarding Asian content in general. And so, in 2019, the idea for the Youth Critics Initiative started as a way of trying to address that gap. Is it possible to invite a whole bunch of writers to a cohort, to the festival as a cohort, to experience the festival together and then go into a long sort of writing incubation process. And so the Youth Critics program begins in the October of the year the festival is held. They experience the festival in November, and then from December till April, they actually go into writing mode and editing mode, and they do multiple rounds of editing with myself and other guest editors who are part of the cohort's support network. And then we also recently last year started to do group critiques, where everybody would, give feedback on each other's work. And then we would launch the pieces over the month of April in tandem with Asian Heritage Month. That's what it's called here. Yes, Asian Heritage Month
Thanks.
in Canada. So that's sort of the general trajectory of the program.
I'm curious about a couple of those things. So, I mean, we're talking about 2019 and 2018. Kelly, you had been working with Jasmine since 2018, and I'm interested in hearing a little bit of some of these consistent patterns or themes that you were noticing. And I mean, what were some of those? Can you expand on that a little bit, Kelly?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start by just saying back in 2018, Jasmine and I, in the office space that we work at, there's like a commons area, and we would commune there. And that's where we would set up our laptops and we would sit and we would work, but really we would be chatting and discussing. Which, I think was really an interesting kind of like just thinking about also the space and the environment that we were in to have these conversations because we both don't come from film. And I think we were both like, on one hand, Jasmine at that time was looking for panelists for the industry and education like panels. And then on my end, it was kind of like the first foray into like the Asian Canadian film landscape. So watching a lot of short film submissions. Um, so it was like a really interesting time where we were like wrestling with this like, okay, why is it that when we think about representation or diasporic narratives, like we see very common, like very repetitive kind of like story structures or motifs, like for example thinking about food, and I know in previous episodes we've like gone over I believe the dumpling story, so thinking about like food prep or food items in which we have our main character preparing as a way to kind of um, find a connection, whether with a family member or just like generally their culture or their history. And so, yeah, we were just so curious about one, this abundance of stories that were quite repetitive. And then two, just thinking about like what the festival serves as like, on the one hand, it's very limited what gets to be screened. Um, and then also this I guess like this question about like how do we actually have dialogue, or how do is it like the one thing to screen a film and then you know like showcase this narrative, but what does it mean when we see like 50 or 100 of these stories? Why is it that these narratives are still like very much something that like is, I guess, like a recurring, or you can expect to see it? So yeah, I think I kind of rambled a little bit, but I feel like it was definitely, we were just curious in this idea of like what the festival space could serve for creatives who found themselves there. And I think Jasmine will probably be able to speak more. I think that's why I'm so interested in youth critics. Like, selfishly, I think Jasmine, I think you shared like this article about criticism as care work, and yeah, I'd love to like maybe hear a bit more about like kind of I think that direction of criticism, not just for the sake of criticism, or attention, or I think the way you position attention as something that's like really important for creatives.
Yeah, do you want to expand on that? Kind of that notion of criticism as care, rather than kind of like criticism as a commodity, I guess, right? Or um, kind of expand on, I think, what do we mean when we say in this format, like this particular program, youth critics, but like what how do you define criticism?
I think that so that article that you're talking about, critique as care, we usually introduce it at the beginning of the program, and all the critics will at least like walk through this article with me, and we do a sort of 101 to set a baseline for what this exercise of criticism is about and what it's meant to do. And I think a lot of the times we imagine criticism to be about establishing an authority either for yourself, like you're like, I am someone you can trust to um, assess whether this thing that I'm talking about is good or bad or not, or it's a way to authorize the thing that's being critiqued, right? Like it's both and. Oh, so the critic and the piece that's being critiqued, those two things are being elevated in that moment, or being put to the spotlight. And so traditionally, like if you think about criticism that way, a lot of it is embroiled in power. And so the very first thing that we want to talk about when we do youth critics is to like look at that power, and then think about ourselves in relationship to that power, because that power has historically not been accessible to many of the folks who come through the youth critics program. And that is why we see the gaps that we see in media. The folks who are in the writing rooms of these media outlets and publications are not people who would be able to necessarily give the kind of work that Real Asian is platforming the right kind of attention and the right kind of accountability, even because it could swing either way, right? And so at Youth Critics, the mental exercise is putting yourself into that position, to willingly put yourself into that position of power where you're like, okay, I am now authorizing myself to comment on this thing, right? And that's like a very difficult thing to do, because with that power comes a lot of scrutiny. And that scrutiny is offered and provided by the editors, and oftentimes by the knowledge that the filmmakers themselves might read these pieces, that the festival program staff might be reading some of these pieces, and just in general that there will be an
I read
audience.
them all. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so I feel like these like layers of support systems that are already in place because of the festival structure allow that mental exercise of the critic putting themselves into that critic position to have like very real stakes, and those real stakes need to exist for the writing to become meaningful. Because if it doesn't have those other considerations, then you can just go off on whatever you want. You don't necessarily have to take responsibility for what you're saying. Nobody's going to push back on your thoughts, like, is this clear enough, is this right, is this, what assumptions are you making here? And like the youth critic space is essentially built as a journey to experience all of those moments in a condensed period of like 6 months. And writers everywhere the world over since time immemorial experience it's like artists of all kinds experience this process of scrutiny, right? And writers critics are no different. So allowing folks to like engage with that process of power, then the words that come out or the pieces that come out, they carry a different kind of weight, I think. And that weight is care work. That weight is that they have put a bit of intention, at the very least intention, a little bit more like carefulness, a little bit more doubt has gone through their minds in terms of whether or not this writing is like doing what it's supposed to do. And I think that combination of things, um, when it comes out in the writing, that creates like a relationship between all of the pieces that I just mentioned, because they're all now in a web of relations, and they cannot be extricated from each other. And that runs counter to a media outlet like a newspaper that just pushes out a 300-word summary of like a film that features a big name director, and it just goes out in their arts and culture column. This is like a very different version of interaction. And I
Hmm.
think youth critics, like the heart of youth critics, is to offer that experience every year to young people, so that they'll have gone through the baptism of fire one time,
Yeah, yeah.
at least one time.
Yeah. No, I think no, you speak to it so well in terms of like the duration of the project to kind of give yourself that time to process it, and that you're not just like cranking out a review, like as if it's like Yelp or a restaurant review or something like that.
Nope.
I mean, I one thing I'm interested in, both like as a programmer, wearing one of my hats, and then like as a filmmaker wearing another hat, and is like how do these things, how does criticism work within that circle or that cycle of production? Like one of the things, talking to Brian Hu in one of our previous episodes, who is a artistic director at San Diego Asian Film Festival. He worked as a critic initially, before he was a programmer. And the idea that, within this kind of Asian diasporic creative space, like the need for criticism to kind of like be part of that creative process. um I've always like felt like, as a filmmaker, like you are a critic, you are a critic of other work, and seeing how your work exists within other works, and how you may build something different, or you're also a critic of your own work too, like, more than anybody's. um, that may vary by the filmmaker, um, but I feel sometimes that, and one of the reasons I'm so interested in this program is I feel like that loop, uh we don't have enough of it, you know what I mean, in our creative community, which I think leads to the situations that Kelly was talking about, in terms of like these like recurrence of themes or certain narratives, and that like, I'm this is a roundabout way to talk about like this idea of criticism versus like support, because that was one of the things that Brian and I talked about, especially, I think, you know we were talking about the kind of early 2000s, and that, but I think this is something that has always been the case, in that like, traditionally, these diasporic communities have not had a lot of resources, and so it's just so hard to get anything done in the first place, that like criticism in that kind of like ratatouille kind of way, right, the food critic,
Right.
who is the
Mhm.
authority, um feels like a threat,
Yeah.
and so like there's this idea of criticism versus support. Like, how can you critique this work? It was so hard for me to do it. Like, I need your support, the community needs to support this,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah, I think there's like so many things that are happening in that conversation. I actually was on a call earlier today with somebody talking about some of these complexities and the complete void in scholarship around Asian Canadian cinema. Like it's so absent, given that Real Asian is the sole producer of the two anthologies in Canada that feature Asian Canadian like media and film.
Which,
It's
yay for us, but boo, right? Like, that's terrible.
exactly. I think it's there's so many levels of absence that need to be contended with, I think, and then at the same time, that absence does not actually mean that nothing was there. And I think that's one of the big struggles, is trying to recoup from absence. But then to do that, you have to find what was there, right? And criticism is a paper trail for that. Criticism is a really great way to leave long term records of like community engagement with something. And they also, because of that power dynamic I mentioned earlier, where the authorization goes both ways, if a piece gets critiqued, whether or not it's good or bad, it's been authorized. It's important in some way to somebody, right? And so from the point of view of a record or documentation, that that's easier to find, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily speak to the value of the project at large, like in a sort of essentialist inherent way. It just is easier when we're contending with like erasure, structural absence, and like the constant loss of our own records, right? Which is something that the Asian community is constantly having to like fight
Hmm.
against, which is like we do stuff and then nobody documents it.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and so that's like one of the things I will, I think speak a little bit to what we are talking about. And then the other part that I'm hoping to regain in my train of thought is around the fact that like criticism, the relational aspect of criticism, what it does also is it creates like long-term memory. And I mean long-term memory from the point of view of like a creator. So so everybody is a critic, correct? Like everybody who watches the film is a critic. Filmmakers are their own critics. Filmmakers are critics of each other. But to write criticism is actually to move from film into a separate art form entirely, right? And so criticism is nonfiction. And nonfiction has its own rules and has its own like principles. It has is like a whole different playing field. And so one of the fun parts of youth critics, and when I say baptism by fire, I mean that literally, because what you get is your cohort. They watch the films and they're all exercising their right to be critics in like the communal sense. So they're all like discussing the films. We call it talking shit, right? Like they're literally doing that in their meetings. That's what they're doing. They're just discussing the films very carefree remarks. Opinions are being thrown around or whatever. And then the gap between that and the first draft is like the most painful experience for like 90% of them. Like they cannot put it down. Like, it's just impossible. And so like honestly, usually from mid-December till late February, all the meetings that I'm doing with the youth critics involves me working with them through like writer's block, anxiety, imposter syndrome, or just like a loss of like literacy. Like suddenly they're like, oh, when we were in that other critic context, it was easy.
Like the
And
talking
then,
shit stage.
yeah, yeah. And now that I have to make the art, like I have to get my hands into the language, like I realize I actually don't know how sentences work anymore, right? And that's like very similar to filmmakers making films, right? Like it's the exact same thing. And I think that's true for all the art forms. And that's why I think like it's really important for the youth critics program to protect the integrity and recognition of criticism as itself a form of art in the writing discipline. Even if they're creating video essays or podcasts, the primary the primary medium of communication is language.
Hmm.
And so they have to contend with those tools. And when they have to work with those tools, then they actually might understand a little bit more how hard it is to make a film, right? And so I actually find that a lot of times critics who start out saying they're going to talk like a real big shit game in their criticism pieces, by the time they get to like draft two, it's like toned down immensely, and that's because of their own suffering. I think there's like an empathy that like occurs there, and I actually think it's extremely fun to watch this as an editor, because it like without fail it happens every single year, and it's like the exact same like bell curve arc that happens every year as well. It doesn't matter how much you like warn people about it, or pat it, or try to vaccinate them, if you will, with like with precautions or whatever. Like the experience of going through that process of being like, okay, now I have a vision and I have to realize it with
Hmm.
these tools, and my personality, my character cannot be assumed, right? Like people won't give me the benefit of the doubt, or people shouldn't give me the benefit of the art has to then hold its own weight to a certain degree. How do I do that? And I feel like that process of writing, and again, right, we're sort of working in this context where writing almost exclusively belongs in, unless you are a writer, like it belongs in categories of like absolute necessity. People are only doing it because they have to.
Hmm.
So they are doing them for deadlines for school, or they're doing it for like funding, or they're doing them for reports, right? Like, and so to ask someone who maybe doesn't have that much experience writing something that's like clearly their own vision, it's still for a deadline, but it's for a deadline that gives them a writing credit. There's no other sort of pressing need, right? And if they drop the piece, there's no consequences, right? It just doesn't ever reach the light of day, right? To then have to contend with the process of following through on their own thoughts all the way to the end, I think that's like an extremely valuable long-term memory that can like hold the community for a very long time, because that
Mhm.
is transferable.
I'm curious about that initial stage because I think you know the kind of hater shit talking stage, like the snarky stage. Like, where do you think that impulse comes from?
um I mean, I feel like you see many different types of haters. A lot of it is like aesthetic camps, right? And like that, like people watch things for different needs and different reasons, and when their needs are not met, they don't like it. And that's why art is like this wonderful place of like fighting all the time, because people's needs are never fully met. Like like a one thing can't meet everybody's needs. I think it's a very humbling moment actually to be like, oh, correct. And this is like very anti-capitalist. There is no one thing fits all ever. And art, if anything, art has that capacity. It's not a guarantee that it will always meet this capacity, but it has potential to like explore that and lean hard into that idea, right? So I think that haterism like does come from a very instinctive part of ourselves to expect something to be given to us. And I think that impulse is actually very neutral or like benign. Like I don't think that's like a bad thing at all. um I think the part where I become more wary is when those comments show up in writing. And in writing, what happens
Mhm.
is the language becomes fixed because it like moves slow, right? Like language, like written language moves slowly, whereas conversation, oral conversation, it sort of dissipates,
Yeah.
like it's like air, right? So when you see the line on screen and it says something like, I dislike this because this, the actually like the absurdity of that logic becomes very clear very quickly. It's like a mirror.
it,
Yeah.
it's really it's interesting you say it because it's also like the initial stage that you are talking about or that we're talking about, like happened in a couple of the cycles of youth critics. It was online festivals, right? So that
Mm.
initial stage had a documentation and a, should I be talking about this spicy chat room? But maybe not, because it's like, I think what you're saying is like, the utterance was meant to be this ephemeral thing, but
Yes.
it's like you read it line by line, and personally as a programmer, like I take that to heart because like,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't, I didn't see it in words before. You know what I mean? Like,
But to that, I do have to point out, like, I think part of this program that's been amazing too is like we can always count on youth critics to ask questions
yes.
Mhm.
after screening a film.
And I think that comes with intent, right? Because they're all
Mhm.
going into it being like, I have to write about something. So I have to go look. I have to go look more carefully. But what I have to write about doesn't have to serve like the purposes of marketing. It doesn't have to serve the purposes of selling a ticket. So then in that inquiry can be led by the self, right? An authorized self within the context of this program. And then that those inquiries and the drafted conclusions or the drafted questions, or further inquiries that emerge from those original questions are then subject to scrutiny of your editors, right? Who are not polite. Like we don't let like a lazy sentence fly at all. And that's why we do publish pieces that we disagree with. That is like, you know what I mean? So there's a difference, right? Like every sentence has to have weight. I call it like you can chew on something and then spit it out, but there must be something to chew on. And so there's like pieces that I've definitely published where I'm just like chew, 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 spit. And I'm like, no, I'm not really into this angle, but I chewed. And like my goal is to make sure that every piece that we put out is like chewable. Um, so there's that. The other part of haterism that I really want to talk about, though, is that people get really high off of power. And I think that's like something to really think about. And I actually really enjoy the 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 fire pit in between. It sounds very sadistic that I keep bringing this back, but I think because I am a writer and go through this process myself on an extremely regular basis, that like having some companionship is kind of fun. But also when you are verbally critiquing, you like, if you are affirmed in that moment, you get a rush of adrenaline, and then you like amp it up a little bit the next time, right? So the first sentence might be something like, "Oh, that wasn't that good," and then when someone's like, "Yeah, I didn't think that was good," and you're like, "Yeah, that was horrible," right? It's like it escalates like very quickly, right? And that's like it's a power trip. Like that's actually what's happening in that moment, is that the person's experiencing power trip, and that power trip is fine and healthy. And then when we get to the writing stage, we have to like unpack the power trip. And I think like unpacking that power trip is like essential education for anybody to really understand that like words have meaning and they have power. And the goal at the end of the day is that like all these art forms that we are producing, whether they're films or it's writing, they have lots and lots of power, and they can go a very long way. They can hurt people, they can encourage people, they can, you know, shine some sort of insight or light. They can also obscure, they can also misunderstand, they can erase or hide. Like they have so many verb functions. Like they can do all these things. And so what do you do when you are the creator of something that has so much like kinetic energy, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
how can you offer care like through that process?
you, you know so just real quick, as an anecdote, like when I was on the road going to a lot of the festivals with my feature film, it was like I got so little feedback, in
Mhm,
terms of like the conversations or the Q&As, where I never found them, or rarely found them very fruitful or meaningful, to the
mhm,
point where and where I grew up in the Bay Area, Asian American, especially in the 90s, like there was a lot of like haters, so many haters, oh my gosh. And you'd have these people who show up at screenings who, they'd come out and, in almost, it felt like they were showing up just tell something tell somebody they suck.
right,
And by the time I was showing it in the Bay Area, I was like dying for that. I was expecting it,
right,
and then, like, please, somebody ask me like a really challenging question,
right.
or something that like, if you didn't like this, like, that's awesome, like, and I would like to know why. And we can talk about the things that I did in this film that you didn't like, and maybe the reasons for it. But and then I didn't get any of that, so it was just like, it's just like, man, I was like so starved. And just this
Mm,
idea of like,
mm,
if the documentation of that process,
mhm,
is really important, even if it is something that is like kind of skewering something. So
mhm,
anyway, I just thought, that's something that kind of really still resonates with me, in terms of like how this program can function, and the various like forms, and kind of like not benefits, I don't mean benefits, but like it can work in so many different ways, I think, for creators on both sides, of people who are writing, filmmakers, to kind of like more deeply think about their work,
mhm, mhm,
and how it's received, and just, those conversations that can come from it.
mhm,
But yeah.
I think what's also really nice about youth critics is it's, I know we've talked a lot about like film specific, but um, like thinking about like last year, some of those pieces really just talked about the context, like the festival experience. I think being very intentional about how they're encountering the work,
mhm,
which is something that I think is so meaningful about youth critics, is like there's room to give value to things that don't often get covered. I don't know if that's the right word. I'm like, what's the
yes,
word?
you're so
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so I'm I I wonder if we can talk about a little bit about where people can find because we're coming up on the fourth cycle of it, but so there's 3 previous years of this cycle. So where can people um
Wait,
Mhm.
is this the
find
fourth?
these works?
Is this not the third?
Yeah, this year's the fourth year.
Oh my god. It is.
Yeah, it's been a while. You can find all of the pieces on a Medium publication. So if you go to tacla.ca, TACLA as in TACLA, .ca, you'll be able to find like a link to our Medium publication that's called Taclanese, like as a joke, like Cantonese, Portuguese, Taclanese. Anyway, it's like a slightly obscure joke.
I get it. I get it.
But yeah, so Taclanese is like the publication that pushes out all the youth critic pieces every year. It's nice because they're multimedia formats.
Hmm.
We really try to push folks to experiment, and some folks like first time trying a new medium. Some are using like skills that they have from other arenas and like merging them, creating hybrid formats. It's really fun. Medium is great because it's a platform for readers, um, so people stumble upon them by accident as well. And it's really interesting to see like spikes of like viewership in like certain pieces when films re-hit the festival circuit.
Mm,
Like older pieces might like suddenly bump up. And then another really interesting thing is that if you read cohort one's pieces versus cohort three, that's like a very strong case there for what an archive can do to improve writing, because cohort three has read cohort two and cohort one. And I actually strongly encourage them to go through all the pieces. And if not, actually during the editing process, when they get stuck, I point them to very specific pieces. I'm like, well, so and so did this in this paragraph in this review that they did, in last year's cohort. They address a similar topic, or it's a very interesting perspective that deviates from something you're thinking of, or their topic scope is kind of similar, but they've approached it with a very different medium. Take a look, see what they've done, imitate, riff, disagree, something, right? And because they actually get prompted multiple times throughout the program to look at these pieces and refer to them. And then in our editing conversations, we then discuss like their reading of those pieces. There's this very strong sense of like building a stronger foundation every time. And I feel like that's just the strongest case, the strongest argument for why this is such a valuable thing, just to see that writing, like everybody is still an emerging writer, right? Like everybody who is in the cohort is doing it for the first time, but because they have like people who have come before them and created work, that paper trail, so to speak, really, really gives them a lot of extra support and a lot of extra reference when it comes to tackling the subject matter, when it comes to tackling craft, when it comes to, oh, you want to talk about like social cultural context, there's a piece in cohort two that's doing
mhm,
that. You want to
mhm,
talk about like production specifically, like there's a piece that talks about that. Oh, you want to talk about politics, here are like 3 pieces that are doing that. And it's just like so great because that literally does not exist outside the scope of this program, not in such a dense way anyway. They're very disparate, and they're not under a banner of like Asian Canadian interest, which the label is problematic in many ways, but it also has like a function, right? Like a political function of like gathering working memory together to like be more critical in what we then produce.
mhm,
So yeah, it's really, really nice. So I'm really
mm.
excited for like cohort 4.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so happy we're having another cohort.
I will say it did spark a cohort or a program in Bali, Indonesia, and
Oh, wait, do I
they.
know this?
I
Maybe I
thought
did.
I thought I mentioned, but
I
yeah, they're
thought,
cohort.
nice.
They just did cohort two, I believe. So yeah,
Hmm.
I think there's been
Hmm.
like yeah, it's definitely has sparked a lot, and like the filmmakers that I share the articles with. Obviously, I read it first before I share it. But I think it like just their feedback, it it really shows like how much like, yeah, it's a gift. It's not taken lightly on their end as well. Like,
Yeah, and there's
yeah.
a big difference between a critique and like a diatribe, like
Mhm.
hate infused commentary has no interest in like a relational engagement. And so if it's there in the draft, like we're going to point it out.
Hmm.
And our favorite comment to leave is "but why?" Just in brackets, "but why?" And like it's happened so often where just like at the end of every paragraph, and so what? So what? So like questions like that, like it's really there's such simple questions that are so incredibly difficult to answer because they really require you to like cross the threshold. And that's like something I teach in writing so often. I'm like, when you've asked a question, the answer is the threshold. You have to cross it and then you actually enter space. And when you are in that space, then the real interesting stuff happens. Like if you just answered the question, then you're literally standing at the doorway, and that's so sad. You're not going anywhere. You haven't entered into like anything meaningful yet. You've just been like, okay, well, now I'm satisfied. Okay. But there's like a whole world to explore beyond that threshold. Um, and I think like film, like all art, has like that immense capacity to hold complex, contradictory, you know, like um, feelings, states of existence. And just like, if we don't address those in us and if we don't give them language, I think there's at least some of us need to give it language, right? Like, otherwise, I think it's a loss to the community.
Hmm.
And that's why going full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, where we're like, why do people keep replicating the same narratives? Is because they don't know that other people have done those narratives before.
Mhm.
um, and the way to know is to leave them a paper trail. Um, and it's so hard to access these films once they're off the circuit, right? It's like for shorts, sometimes it's like, you're lucky you find them on YouTube, but then there's no algorithm that's like Asian Canadian content here, take a look, right? Like there's nothing like that to organize it. And so it's really either accidental or you have to plug in to like a community that is interested in those things already and can then transfer that knowledge by word of mouth. And even then, maybe you won't be able to get a physical copy of something to watch, right? Like we don't have the DVDs, we don't have like they're not on the streaming sites. Where do you get that? At least if you have a paper trail, you're like, oh, maybe I can ask the library to acquire it, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's like the other complex, like Swiss cheese wheel, like part of the conversation where it's just like too many holes. We cannot address them all. Here, we're just addressing this like tiny little part of the cheese.
Oh my God, sorry. I love that. I know we got the Swiss cheese analogy, and now we also have to add to the sausage behind the
Oh,
scenes
oh
sausage
God.
making strategy.
Part of the backstory,
Festival
canon
sausage. Yeah.
of food metaphors.
Yes, add it to the list. Add it.
Make a sticker sheet, guys. You can make a sticker sheet with all the food metaphors.
Oh,
No, I was joking.
anything for stickers. But
Uh,
well, I think that's like such a kind of a nice way to kind of come full circle. Should we ask Jasmine a few quick fire questions, Aram, or?
Yes.
oh
But
no,
there's one that I'm like, oh, I already know the answer, so I'm not
I don't
gonna.
want to
Yeah,
answer.
We'll
because you know the answer and you don't like it. That's
Wait, no,
that's
Aaron, ask me the question because I have like a newly evolved answer for it.
oh,
Actually,
okay.
Oh,
Okay.
really?
Oh,
I
okay.
Oh.
told I'll give you context right later. Okay, ask me a question. Ask me a question.
Okay. All right. Well, it's we're just skipping to the question that everybody wants to know. Um, you choose your favorite carbohydrate:
Okay.
rice, noodles,
Mhm.
bread, potatoes. What is it?
Okay. So my theory is that the carbs live on like Uling Mountain. All right. They live on Uling Mountain. They're each like a martial arts sect. Okay. Team Potato and Team Bread are like minor sects and they like sort of live lower down and like only get involved if there's like a huge gathering where all the sects have to like have a meeting because like some big ass shit is happening in Uling and like everybody needs to know about it. Otherwise, the top of Wuling is like Team Noodle and Team Rice, and they're just like always going at it. And like Team Rice is like the quiet, like monk-like folks that just like meditate and hang out in their perfect little like homes, and they're just like, we are the best, but they like do that within the space of like their hall. And then right outside the hall is like Team Noodle being like, we are the best, like incessantly all the time in your face, and they're like throwing rocks in you, and it's just like, it's too much. So I'm Team Rice.
Yes.
Noodles are just passionate.
The thing is, when I first told Kelly this, they couldn't refute it because it's true. They were just like big assholes for like 5 minutes right before that, and all attacking me. There were 3 Team Noodles at the table, and they're just attacking me nonstop. And I gave this analogy, and then I got some peace. They were like, "Oh, maybe we should retreat back to our hall and think about the principles of our sect."
It seemed like Kelly was hoping for a different answer, but
no, I was like, I'm just kind of curious how she'll talk about Rice this time around.
Oh, sorry. Okay, what are the quick fire questions there? Give me.
No, that's the only one.
Question, sorry.
Okay, well, thanks, Jasmine. Thanks for coming on Backstory for the first time and talking about criticism and Youth Critics Program. Cycle 4 will be out in May 2023, right?
Yes. May
All right.
2023.
All right.
Woohoo.
Well, thank you. And this has been another episode of Backstory. I'm Aram Collier.
And I'm Kelly Loy. And
I'm Jasmine. I realized if I said my last name, it would rhyme, and that would be a terrible way to end.
Backstory Podcast is presented by the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. It's written and hosted by Kelly Loy and Aram Collier. Produced and edited by Jennifer Su. For more information on the show and the festival, please visit us at realasian.com. And check out the show notes to find out more about YCI and read pieces from this year's critics.